The Korean Mafia boss arrived at the wedding just as the officiant asked if anyone objected, and what he did next was unthinkable. The ballroom fell silent except for the rustle of silk and the soft notes of a string quartet. 200 guests sat in perfectly arranged rows, their breath held in anticipation. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over an altar drowning in white roses and peonies. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. Everything was wrong. Han Tae-Sung stood at the back of the venue, his hand gripping the brass door handle so tightly the metal creaked. The custom-tailored black suit that normally made him look like carved obsidian now felt suffocating. Traditional Korean tattoos, dragons and phoenixes, crawled beneath his crisp white collar, marks of power that meant nothing in this moment. His normally cold, calculating eyes held something foreign, something he'd never felt even when signing death warrants or negotiating territorial wars. Panic, raw, unfiltered panic. Because there, at the end of the white silk aisle, stood Simone Brooks. His Simone, except she wasn't his anymore, had never really been his at all. The sleeveless white gown transformed her into something ethereal, the fabric-hugging curves he'd trained himself not to notice during 12 months of cold professionalism. Her dark skin glowed against the ivory silk. Her natural curls were swept into an elegant updo that exposed the graceful line of her neck, a neck he'd once watched bend over contracts and spreadsheets in his office, never allowing himself to imagine it arching back in pleasure. She looked distant, conflicted, but composed. And she was holding another man's hand. But before we find out whether the most dangerous man in the Lee Syndicate is about to burn down this entire wedding, if you're loving this story of forbidden love and dangerous obsession, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, drop a comment telling me if you think Simone should choose safety or passion, and share this with someone who loves a good mafia romance. Seriously, Mafia Moonlight Tales brings you stories where love is as dangerous as it is irresistible, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, back to the wedding. Tae-Sung had tried to stay away. God knows he tried. For 3 months after their contract expired, after Simone had quietly packed her things from the penthouse they'd shared in name only, he told himself it was for the best. She deserved more than a paper marriage to a monster. More than cold dinners and colder stares from the syndicate elders, who'd never approved of her presence in their world. More than loving a man who'd forced her into a business arrangement to satisfy the Lee family's archaic requirement that all ranking members be married. But then his informant had called. "Boss, you need to know something. It's about Miss Brooks." Now Tae-Sung stood frozen as the officiant's voice carried across the ballroom, each word landing like a blade between his ribs. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Simone Brooks and Michael Harrison." Michael Harrison, a corporate attorney, safe, legitimate, everything Tae-Sung could never be. The groom stood tall and confident in his grey suit, his hand clasped around Simone's like he had a right to touch her. His smile was warm and open, the smile of a man who'd never ordered an execution, never washed blood from his hands, never built an empire on fear and violence. Tae-Sung's jaw clenched so tight he tasted copper. He'd spent a year with Simone, a year of watching her move through his penthouse like a ghost, perfectly efficient, perfectly invisible. She'd attended syndicate dinners with a practiced smile, had stood beside him during territorial negotiations, had slept in the guest room while he'd lain awake imagining what it would feel like to cross that hallway and make their marriage real. He'd seen the way she'd looked at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't watching. The quiet heartbreak in her eyes when syndicate wives would sneer at her in Korean, assuming she didn't understand. The resignation when he'd introduce her as his contractual obligation, rather than his wife. And he'd done nothing, said nothing, because Han Tae-Sung didn't do love. Love was weakness. Love got you killed. Except now, watching her stand at an altar meant for another man, Tae-Sung realized he'd been wrong. Not loving her was what was killing him. "If anyone has objections to this union," the officiant announced, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, "speak now or forever hold your peace." The silence that followed was supposed to be brief, ceremonial, meaningless. But then Tae-Sung's footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Heavy, rhythmic, deliberate. Every head turned, gasps rippled through the crowd, someone screamed. The bodyguard beside Tae-Sung moved with military precision, hand inside his jacket, but Tae-Sung waved him back with a subtle gesture. He didn't need weapons for this. Simone's eyes went wide. Her face drained of color as she watched him approach. This man who'd held her at arm's length for 12 months. This man who'd treated their marriage like a signature on a contract, rather than a bond between souls. "Tae-Sung," she breathed, his name barely a whisper. He stopped 3 feet from the altar, close enough to see the way her hands trembled, close enough to smell the jasmine perfume she always wore, close enough to notice she wasn't wearing the diamond ring he'd given her during their contract signing, the one she'd left on his desk the day she walked out. "I object," he said, his voice wrapped in silk-covered steel. The groom stepped forward, protective, foolish. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but you need to leave." T1's gaze never left Simone. "I'm the man who married her first." The chaos at the altar dissolved as the memory pulled T1 back to where it all began. 14 months ago, the Lee Syndicate's council chamber had felt like a tomb. Mahogany paneling absorbed sound. Cigar smoke hung thick in the air. 8 men sat around an obsidian table, their faces carved from stone and prejudice. "The family requires marriage," Elder Park had announced, his Korean sharp and unforgiving. "You are 34, Han T1, unmarried. This makes you weak in the eyes of our allies." T1 had stood at the head of that table, every muscle controlled, every emotion buried. He'd built the West Coast operation from nothing, had turned the Lee Syndicate into an empire that made other families tremble. But tradition was a chain even he couldn't break. "I'll handle it," he'd said. "You have 60 days. Find a suitable Korean woman from an appropriate family, or we'll choose for you." The door to his office had opened with a whisper. Simone Brooks entered carrying files, her movements efficient, her expression neutral. She'd been his secretary for 2 years, the best he'd ever had. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them, navigated his world without flinching, and asked no questions about the blood that sometimes stained his cuffs. "The contracts you requested, Mr. Han." He'd studied her then, really studied her. The sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength in the set of her shoulders, the way she existed in his dangerous world without becoming part of it. An idea formed, terrible and perfect. "Miss Brooks, sit down." She'd hesitated, then obeyed. They'd never had a conversation that wasn't about business. "I need a wife," he'd said bluntly. "Not a real one, a paper arrangement, 12 months. You'll live in my penthouse, attend necessary functions, and maintain the appearance of marriage. In exchange, I'll pay you $5 million and ensure your student loans disappear." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. "Why me?" Her voice was steady, but he'd caught the tremor underneath. "Because you're invisible to them. You're not Korean, not connected to any family, not a threat. You're perfect because you don't matter to anyone but me." He'd watched something flicker across her face. Pain maybe, or resignation. "And after 12 months, you walk away, free and clear, we both get what we need." She'd looked at the contract he slid across his desk. Her hands had shaken slightly as she picked up the pen. "This is insane," she'd whispered. "It's business, Miss Brooks, nothing more." She'd signed her name in elegant script, and T1 had told himself the tightness in his chest was relief, not guilt. He hadn't known then that forcing Simone Brooks into a loveless contract would be the biggest mistake of his life. Or that watching her sign her name to another man's marriage license would finally wake him up. The penthouse had 43 windows and felt like a mausoleum. Simone learned this in her first week as Han T1's contract wife. She counted every pane of glass during the endless hours she spent alone, watching Seoul's skyline blur with rain, while her husband conducted business in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. The wedding itself had been a cold affair. City Hall, 2 witnesses pulled from T1's security detail, a judge who'd asked no questions when an envelope thick with cash appeared. She'd worn a cream dress she'd bought on sale. He'd worn the same expression he wore when signing execution orders. "You may kiss the bride," the judge had said. T1's lips had brushed her cheek, professional, distant, a transaction completed. The syndicate dinner came 3 days later. "Remember," T1 had said in the car, adjusting his cufflinks without looking at her. "Smile, stay quiet, let me handle the talking." The private room at Jeong's had been filled with smoke and judgment. Syndicate wives sat like porcelain dolls in their designer hanbok, their eyes sharp as they assessed the outsider who dared enter their world. Elder Park's wife had spoken first, her Korean deliberately rapid. "She doesn't even understand our language. How can she be a proper wife to a Lee man?" Simone had understood every word. Her mother had made sure she learned Korean along with 3 other languages, but she'd stayed silent, playing the role T1 had purchased. His hand had found hers under the table, a warning, not comfort. His grip was ice. "My wife's qualifications are not your concern," he'd said, his voice wrapped in silk-covered steel. But the damage was done. For the next 11 months, every syndicate function became a gauntlet. The wives whispered in Korean about the black secretary who'd trapped their rising star. They'd bump into her with scalding tea, apologize in English dripping with false sweetness. They'd discuss her like she was furniture, assuming ignorance gave them permission. Tae-Sung never defended her. Not really. He'd issue cold warnings when things escalated, but his eyes remained distant, his touch purely for show. At home, they existed in separate orbits. He worked until 3 in the morning. She organized his life with perfect efficiency, their interactions limited to calendar updates and meal preferences. The guest room became her sanctuary, though some nights she'd stand in the hallway outside his door, hand raised to knock, wondering what would happen if she crossed that threshold. She never did. The worst part wasn't the syndicate's disapproval or Tae-Sung's coldness. It was the moments in between, when he'd absently touch the small of her back while navigating a crowd, when she'd catch him watching her with something that looked almost like longing, when their fingers would brush exchanging documents and electricity would arc between them before he'd pull away like she'd burned him. Those moments made the cage beautiful. Those moments made her forget it was all pretend. Those moments destroyed her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, during a rainstorm that turned Seoul's streets to rivers. Simone stood in Tae-Sung's office, organizing files while he reviewed territorial reports. Thunder rattled the windows. Lightning illuminated his profile, sharp and beautiful, and utterly unreachable. 9 months into their contract, 3 months left until freedom. 3 months left until her heart would finally stop hopping for the impossible. Mrs. Han, his voice cut through her thoughts. The title still felt like a knife. I need you to prepare for the charity gala tomorrow. Elder Kim will be there with his daughter. Of course, she kept her voice steady, professional. What time should I be ready? 7, wear something traditional if you have it. Something inside her cracked. Traditional, you mean something that might make them forget what I actually am. His eyes snapped to hers, dark and unreadable. Simone. It's fine, Mr. Han, she turned back to the files. I understand my role. The silence that followed was suffocating. She felt him stand, heard his footsteps approach. His presence behind her was overwhelming, heat and danger, and everything she couldn't have. You don't understand anything, he said quietly. She spun to face him, and for once she didn't hide the pain. Then explain it to me. Explain why you brought me into this world if you were just going to let them treat me like I'm nothing. Explain why you touch me like I matter, and then look through me like I'm glass. Because you're not supposed to matter. His jaw was tight, his control fracturing. This was supposed to be simple, a contract, an arrangement. And is it? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Is it still simple for you? She watched something war behind his eyes. For one desperate moment, she thought he might finally tell the truth. That the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking meant something. That the nights he'd stood outside her door, his shadow visible beneath the crack, weren't her imagination. But then his mask slammed back into place. You should get some rest, Miss Brooks. Tomorrow will be long. Miss Brooks, not Simone, not his wife. The dismissal was absolute. She'd gone to her room and finally let herself cry. Not because of the syndicate wives who'd called her a gold digger in rapid Korean at last week's dinner. Not because Elder Park had suggested Tae-Sung should take a proper Korean mistress since his current wife was clearly inadequate. She cried because she'd fallen in love with a man carved from obsidian and ice. A man who'd purchased her presence but would never want her heart. A man who made her feel invisible even when she was standing right in front of him. 3 months, she'd told herself, wiping away tears. 3 months and she'd be free. She'd had no idea that freedom would cost her everything. The contract expired on a Sunday at midnight. Simone had packed methodically, each item folded with the same precision she'd used organizing Tae-Sung's life for 3 years. 2 as his secretary, 1 as his wife. The penthouse was silent except for the whisper of fabric and the thundering of her own heartbeat. Tae-Sung was in Tokyo, a territorial negotiation that required his personal attention. He'd left Friday morning with barely a goodbye, his mind already on business. He didn't know that today marked the end of their arrangement, or maybe he did and simply didn't care enough to acknowledge it. She'd left the diamond ring on his desk, exactly where she'd found the original contract 12 months ago. No note, what could she possibly say? Thank you for the money. Sorry I broke the rules by falling in love with you. Good luck finding someone who can survive your world without losing herself. Her phone buzzed, a text from her friend Maya. Car's downstairs, you sure about this? Simone typed back, "I'm sure." She wasn't sure about anything except that staying would kill her. The guest room looked sterile now, stripped of the small touches she'd added. The books were gone from the nightstand. The jasmine candles she'd burned to cover the scent of his cigars were packed away. It was like she'd never existed here at all. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she'd always been a ghost. She took one last walk through the penthouse. The kitchen where she'd learned he took his coffee black with one sugar. The living room where they'd sat in silence, reading separate books on opposite couches, existing in the same space but different universes. The hallway outside his bedroom where she'd stood so many nights, hand raised, hopping. His door was open, she shouldn't go in, but her feet carried her forward anyway. The room smelled like him, sandalwood and smoke and something uniquely T1. His bed was perfectly made, his suits hung in military precision, everything controlled, everything ordered, everything cold. Except on his nightstand, she saw something that made her breath catch. A photograph, creased and worn like it had been handled repeatedly. The charity gala from 2 months ago. Someone had captured them in an unguarded moment. T1 was looking at her while she laughed at something Elder Kim had said, and the expression on his face was raw and unguarded and absolutely devastating. He'd looked at her like she was oxygen. Simone's hand trembled as she picked up the photo. All this time, she'd thought she was invisible, but this photo told a different story. This photo suggested that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been the only one trapped in a gilded cage. But it didn't matter. A photograph couldn't erase 12 months of distance. A single unguarded moment couldn't compete with a year of cold shoulders and colder words. She placed the photo back exactly where she'd found it. Then Simone Brooks walked out of Han T1's life, leaving nothing behind but a ring and the ghost of what could have been. T1 returned from Tokyo to an empty penthouse and a ring on his desk. For 10 minutes he stood frozen, staring at the diamond catching light from the city below. The contract had expired. She'd honored their agreement to the letter. This was exactly what was supposed to happen. So why did his chest feel like someone had carved out his lungs? He'd known the date, of course, had scheduled the Tokyo trip deliberately to avoid the messy complications of goodbyes. Clean breaks were easier. This was business, nothing more. Except his feet carried him to the guest room, and the emptiness there hit him like a bullet. No jasmine candles, no books stacked haphazardly on the nightstand, no silk robe hanging on the bathroom door. She'd erased herself completely, efficiently, the way she did everything. He found himself in his own bedroom, drawn by instinct he didn't understand. The photograph on his nightstand had been moved, just slightly, enough that he knew she'd seen it. She'd seen the evidence of his obsession and left anyway. The first week he told himself it was relief. The syndicate was satisfied. Elder Park had already mentioned a suitable Korean woman from a shipping family. Everything could return to normal. But normal felt like drowning. His new secretary was competent but wrong. She organized his schedule differently, made his coffee with 2 sugars instead of 1, didn't understand that he needed the quarterly reports color-coded by territory, didn't know that Thursday meetings ran long and he'd need dinner sent up. Didn't know him. The second week he started searching. Find her, he'd ordered his head of security. Boss, the contract. I don't care about the contract, find Simone Brooks. She'd covered her tracks well, too well, like she'd learned from watching him operate. No credit card trail, no lease agreements, no digital footprint. She'd vanished into thin air and the not knowing was acid in his veins. He started drinking, not enough to impair him, but enough to dull the edge of her absence. Enough to stop himself from standing outside her empty room at 3 a.m, wondering what he'd lost. The syndicate dinners became unbearable. He'd look at the empty chair beside him and see her ghost. The way she'd held her head high when Elder Park's wife had spilled tea on her dress. The slight tremor in her hands when they'd speak Korean around her, cruel and deliberate. The quiet dignity she'd maintained while his world had tried to break her. He'd let them. He'd stood there in his silk-covered steel and let them tear her apart because acknowledging what she meant would have made him weak. Now weakness was all he had left. Boss, his security chief's voice pulled him from the whiskey. We found her. T1's heart stopped. Where? Los Angeles, but sir, there's something you need to know. The photograph his man slid across the desk showed Simone in a bridal boutique, smiling at a man in a grey suit. T1's world caught fire. The flight to Los Angeles felt like drowning in slow motion. T1 sat in first class, knuckles white around a glass of whiskey he couldn't taste. His security chief had provided details with clinical efficiency. The groom's name was Michael Harrison, corporate attorney, no criminal record, no ties to any organization. Clean, safe, everything T1 wasn't. They'd met at a grief counseling group, both recovering from loss. Harrison had lost his sister to cancer. Simone had lost. T1's jaw clenched. What had she lost? A year of her life, her dignity, or something deeper that he'd been too blind to see? The wedding was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the Biltmore. 300 guests, an orchestra, white roses imported from Ecuador. Harrison had spared no expense for his bride. His bride? The words tasted like poison. T1's driver pulled up to the venue at 1:45. The Biltmore rose before him like a monument to everything he'd destroyed. Marble columns, gold-trimmed archways, legitimate wealth earned through legitimate means. He could have given her this, should have given her this. Boss, we can still turn around. His bodyguard's voice was careful. This isn't our territory, if things go wrong. They already went wrong. T1 straightened his tie, months ago. The ceremony had already started when he entered through the side entrance. He'd bribed the coordinator with enough money to buy her silence and cooperation. The ballroom stretched before him, a sea of pastel colors and expensive perfume, so different from the smoke-filled syndicate rooms where he'd paraded Simone like a trophy he was ashamed to claim. Then he saw her. Time stopped, sound faded. The entire world narrowed to the woman standing at the altar in white silk. She was radiant. The sleeveless gown showcased the elegant strength of her shoulders, shoulders that had carried the weight of his world without breaking. Her natural curls were swept up, exposing the graceful curve of her neck. She looked like a queen. She looked happy. She looked like she was about to promise forever to someone else. T1's chest constricted. In his world he took what he wanted. He negotiated, manipulated, destroyed obstacles. But standing there, watching Simone glow for another man, he realized he'd already lost her. He'd lost her the moment he'd called her invisible. The moment he'd let the syndicate wives tear her down while he stood silent. The moment he'd chosen his empire over her heart. The officiant's voice drifted across the ballroom. If anyone has objections to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace. This was his moment, his last chance. He could stay silent, let her have the happy ending she deserved with a man who'd probably never make her cry. He could do the right thing for once in his blood-stained life. But Han T1 had never been good at doing the right thing. His footsteps echoed like gunshots as he walked down the aisle. Michael Harrison was everything T1 despised. Clean-cut, respectable, safe. "Sir, I don't know who you are," Harrison said, his voice steady despite the fear flickering in his eyes, "but you need to leave." T1's gaze never left Simone. "I'm the man who married her first." Gasps rippled through the crowd like shockwaves. Simone's face drained of color, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Harrison's grip on her tightened, protective and possessive. "That marriage ended," Harrison said, stepping partially in front of Simone. "Legally, months ago, whatever you had is over." "Is it?" T1 finally looked at the groom, and his eyes carried the weight of 1,000 threats. "Did she tell you why she married me? Did she explain what our arrangement was?" "Stop," Simone's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "T1, don't." But he was done stopping, done being controlled. A business transaction, Harrison, $5 million for 12 months of her time. That's what our marriage was worth, a line item in my budget. He watched pain flash across her face and hated himself for weaponizing their past. But he needed Harrison to understand, needed everyone to understand. "So you bought her," Harrison said, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Coerced her into a fake marriage, and now you're here to what? Claim ownership." T1's laugh was bitter. "I'm here because I was a fool." He moved closer, and 2 bodyguards materialized from the crowd. Harrison's security, probably. They wouldn't stop him if he wanted to end this, but violence wasn't what he came for. Simone, her name on his lips was a prayer. "Look at me." She did, and the anguish in her eyes nearly broke him. "I treated you like you were invisible," he said, his voice raw in a way it had never been. "I let them tear you apart while I stood silent. I took everything you gave me and offered nothing in return. I know this, I own this." "Then why are you here?" Her voice cracked. "The contract's over. You got what you needed. I got my money. We're done." "We're not done." He took another step, close enough now that he could smell her jasmine perfume. "We'll never be done because I made the mistake of believing I could survive without you." Harrison moved to intervene, but Simone held up her hand, stopping him. The guests watched in stunned silence. Someone's phone was recording. This would be all over social media within the hour. T1 didn't care. You want to know why I'm here? He reached into his jacket, and Harrison's security tensed, but what emerged wasn't a weapon. It was their contract, torn into pieces. I'm here to tear up the paper, T1 said, and offer you something real. The torn contract pieces fell like snow between them, settling on the white silk runner. Real? Simone's voice shook with a fury T1 had never heard. You want to talk about real? You had 12 months to make it real. 12 months while I stood beside you and let your world destroy me piece by piece. I know. You don't know anything. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And she didn't bother wiping them away. Do you have any idea what it's like to love someone who looks through you like your glass? To stand in a room full of people who hate you, while the one person who's supposed to protect you stays silent? Simone, I learned Korean for you, the words exploded from her. I spent hours studying so I could understand every cruel thing they said, every insult, every slur, and you knew I understood, and you still did nothing. The ballroom was absolutely silent, 300 witnesses to his sins. You're right, T1 said, and his voice was stripped of every defense. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping distance, that if the syndicate thought you meant nothing, they couldn't use you against me, but the truth is I was protecting myself. He took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. Because somewhere between the contract signing and the charity galas, between the silent dinners and the moments our hands would touch, I fell in love with you. And love is the most dangerous thing a man like me can feel. Simone's bouquet slipped from her fingers. Love makes you weak, he continued, his control shattering. Love makes you vulnerable. Love gives your enemies a target, so I buried it, locked it away, convinced myself that what I felt was just convenience, familiarity, anything but love. Stop, she whispered. I can't stop, not anymore. He closed the distance between them and Harrison tried to intervene, but Simone held him back with a look. You were never just my secretary, Simone. You were never just a contract. You were the only person who saw past the monster. The only one who looked at my blood-stained hands and didn't flinch. Because I was paid not to flinch. No, his voice turned fierce. The money couldn't buy what you gave me. Your strength, your grace. The way you'd leave jasmine candles burning because you knew the cigar smoke gave me headaches. The way you'd color-code my reports because you understood how my mind worked. The way you'd stand tall when they tried to break you. He reached for her hand and she didn't pull away. I kept a photograph of you on my nightstand, he confessed. I'd stare at it every night, memorizing the way you smiled when you thought no one was watching. I stood outside your door at 3 a.m, hand on the handle, wanting so desperately to cross that threshold but too terrified to admit what it meant. T1. I love you, Simone Brooks, not as my secretary, not as my contract wife, as the woman who owns every broken piece of my soul. The silence stretched like a wire pulled to breaking. Simone stared at T1, this man who'd ruled an empire with ruthless precision, but now stood before her stripped bare. His confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. 300 guests held their breath, waiting for her verdict. You love me, she said finally, her voice hollow. Now, after I've moved on, after I've found someone who doesn't need 12 months to realize I'm worth more than a contract. Michael stepped forward, his hand gentle on her shoulder. Simone, we don't have to do this. Security can escort him out. But she shook her head. This was hers to finish. Do you know what the worst part was, T1? It wasn't the syndicate wives or the cruel dinners or even the loneliness. It was hope. Her voice cracked. Every time you'd look at me a second too long. Every time your hand would linger when we'd exchange papers. Every time I'd catch you standing outside my door, I'd hope that maybe you felt it too. I do. But you chose fear over me. Every single day, you chose your empire, your control, your safety over taking a chance on us. She looked down at the torn contract pieces scattered at their feet. And now you show up here expecting me to what? Throw away my future because you finally found your courage. T1's jaw tightened. No, I'm not expecting anything, but I needed you to know the truth before you promised forever to someone else. The truth, Simone laughed, bitter and broken. The truth is I loved you so much I would have stayed in that gilded cage forever if you just once looked at me like I mattered, like I was more than invisible. You were never invisible to me. His voice turned desperate. You were blinding. You were everything I couldn't allow myself to want. Michael cleared his throat. Simone, sweetheart, what do you want to do? She looked at her fiancé. Kind, stable Michael who'd never made her cry, who'd spent 3 months courting her properly, with flowers and weekend trips and promises of a safe, normal life, who'd never looked at her like she was both his salvation and his destruction. Then she looked at T1, the man who'd broken her heart, the man who'd built walls around himself so high she'd needed a year to see the cracks, the man who'd finally torn himself open in front of 300 witnesses because losing her was more terrifying than showing weakness. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of both futures pressing down on her. I want to be more than a choice made in fear, more than a last-minute confession at someone else's wedding. She pulled the engagement ring from her finger and placed it in Michael's palm. I'm so sorry, she whispered to him. You deserve someone whose heart isn't already owned by a dangerous man in an obsidian suit. Then she turned to T1, her eyes blazing. And you're going to prove every word you just said.